Today I'm going to talk a little bit about growing herbs. And a neighbor down the street actually asked me about my herbs that I have in my garden here. And I let her know that typically when I'm here in the States, I don't actually grow too many herbs for cooking. Don't have as much time for cooking as I do when I'm back overseas in Thailand mostly, and a little bit in the Philippines. My situation is where I'm at in Thailand, and given when I'm out there, I have a lot of free time on my hands, so I have plenty of time to spend 2-3 hours cooking up a meal. And then plus I'll usually invite a couple people over anyways, and so I like to have fresh herbs for cooking when I'm able to cook really nice meals. Now I also have a little bit of time when I'm in the Philippines, so typically I'll buy some herbs out there and have them just sitting either on my deck or on my windowsill. But here in the States, last year I grew my herbs. Most of the herbs I grew last year was more for accompany plants, and to also deter the insects and bugs that were on my vegetables and in my vegetable garden. So that's kind of the main reason why I went ahead and grew the herbs last year. Now these are the herbs I have. They're mostly in pots. I do them because I like to kind of move them around the garden to accompany certain vegetables, and it helps deter the bugs and the insects that are liking my vegetables. Now, starting from the beginning, you can either start your seeds indoors, plant them or sow them directly into the ground, or if you're okay with spending a few dollars, just buying the herbs already in the small containers, and you can always replant them into bigger containers, and that may be an easier route to go for yourself. So decide exactly, do you want to start them in the ground, in your raised bed? Do you want to go ahead and grow them indoors first from seed and then transplant them outside? Is it more efficient for you to just go buy the herbs already growing and keep them in the containers, or replant them into the bigger containers? So once you do that, always try to figure out kind of the list of herbs you like. Now, for me, most of the herbs that I grew last year were basically accompany plants, plants that help me keep the insects and the bugs that were giving me the most problems in my vegetable garden, and I planted those. Now I did grow some herbs. The main ones that I grew for cooking purposes were the oregano, which I actually use for oregano tea, which is this plant right here. And I actually have 4 of these plants growing in the yard, and they're all in pots, so they're easily movable. They do help deter the insects too. But I grew the oregano in pots, and they're flourishing. And then I also grew rosemary because I do cook with rosemary. And then of course I grow a lot of cilantro because cilantro is a item they use in a lot of my cooking recipes. Now the spearmint and mint, I can definitely use those for tea and other purposes. Even for a topping, you can place the leaf on top of your creme brulee, and I do make creme brulee from scratch. But for the most part, the mint that I have growing is really for deterring bugs and insects, and I put them as accompanying plants for my vegetable garden. Now, when you're dealing with the vegetable garden, one of the things that you are going to have to pay attention to is making sure that you have a nice sunny area. Most herbs grow best in ample sun. Now, you can get away with as little as 4 to 5 hours of sunlight at a minimum, but most herbs tend to like to have about 7 to 8 hours of sunshine. Now, when you're talking about tender herbs like basil, parsley, and cilantro, they usually benefit from filter sun or protection from sun at the hottest afternoon in summer. So as you can see over there in the far corner at the edge of the house, I have a small pot that's covered. Now it's cilantro in there, and it is very sensitive to very hot sun and direct sun in the middle part of the day. So I've learned from last year to just go ahead, and once I start my cilantro from seeds, I go ahead and put them in the corner of that garage door. It gets the morning sun when it's the weakest, and then as the sun comes around in the hottest part of the day, it's in the shade. So it just gets the indirect natural light. Now when that cilantro gets nice and big and it gets to at least this size, then I'll go ahead and move them slowly but surely, inch them closer and closer to the warmer weather. Now keep in mind, cilantro, we grow that for the leaves, right? But if you put them in directly in hot sun for too long of a period of time, although it starts taking off, eventually it also bolts and turns to flower buds and then flowers itself, which changes the flavor and texture of the leaves. So we always kind of want to keep it as in areas that aren't so sun direct in the middle part of the day, if at all possible. Now, a good fix to that too is also using like the paint strainer bags, right? So if you can't move your cilantro, or you're just in an area where it's just going to get beat down sun all day long, I know people who will go ahead and put the paint strainer bags, or even like cheesecloth bags, over their cilantro and just keep them covered at all times, because basically you're basically shielding tender type herbs like basil, parsley, and cilantro, and they benefit a lot more from the filtered sun. Now, talking about soil, just like any other vegetables, most of the herbs, they do like good soil. And so if you're going to grow them in pots, make sure you use potting soil mix. Make sure it's well draining and not soggy, because just like anything else that we grow here in the garden, they don't like soggy roots. So if you're going to go ahead and do container gardening, use specific container soil potting mix. And then I like to amend my soil. As long as you have extra peat moss and perlite available, go ahead and add perlite to give it more aeration, a little more nutrients for the peat moss if you want. That helps with the drainage and giving it extra nutrients, so that way your herbs grow nice and easy. You want to avoid clay soil, and heavy soils. So if you're going to go ahead and plant them directly into your garden, you may need to amend your soil with early on in the season with compost soil, earthworm castings or worm castings, along with adding compost, peat moss, earth castings, earthworms. Those are good things to add into your mix before you actually plant your seeds or plant your transplants in your direct garden. Now, one thing I do add, and I know a lot of people don't do this, but I do it because here in the Pacific Northwest, and especially in my backyard when I used to grow the herbs back there, not only did I have a lot of clay dirt back there that was really bad, but it also was not very draining and very compact and hard. And so I had to, early in the season, a month before I even started planting, I would go ahead and add the peat moss, the perlite, and compost soil to the mix. And I would go ahead and work that soil and till that soil just to get it up and running and looking a lot better before I even bothered to plant anything. Now, with a raised bed, you go ahead and use raised bed specific soil. You can go to any store and they'll have raised bed soil. And so if you do that, that's pretty easy and efficient. Now, in terms of fertilizer, herbs they're not very heavy feeders, so you don't actually really need to feed a lot of your herbs. So when it comes to my oregano, my rosemary, my mint, I don't actually go ahead and fertilize it. Now, with my cilantro, my dill, I'll hit it maybe once a month, maybe once every 4 to 8 weeks with a water soluble fertilizer, only at half strength. But I noticed that like my rosemary and my mints, this one here is a spearmint right here, and this one is just a regular mint. I've never fertilized it, and it's just doing just fine. And so it's something that isn't really needed for most herbs that you grow. And when it comes to watering, herbs can dry out very easily, especially in pots. So just make sure if you're going to go ahead and grow herbs in pots that you check the moisture level. Stick your finger in the dirt about 2 to 3 inches deep and see exactly if the soil is moist. They don't like drowning wet soil, so they don't want to be soggy roots because they'll rot and die. And I think a lot of people tend to overwater in pots, but you also don't want it to get bone dry on a hot day. And I just noticed that my cilantro here, this cilantro is fine. You can tell that it's slightly damp on the top, but this one here, the top is dry, and I put my finger in there and it's pretty dry, about 2, 3 inches, 3 inches below. So I'm going to go ahead and water this after I'm done talking with you guys. Now, the reason I grow a lot of my herbs here in the States is for accompanying plants for vegetables. So like dill and basil are natural protectors for tomato plants. So I grew a lot of tomatoes, as you guys saw last year, and I grew a lot of dill and basil. Now, one thing great about dill and basil is I use the basil, Genovese basil, for making marinara sauces and jazzing up my canned sauces. And then I use the dill for when I can pickling cucumbers, making pickles. And then I also use the dill for dill sauce. So it was great to be able to grow that and help protect my tomato plants. But it was nice to have those that I can actually eat and use. Now, another plant that's really good for accompanying plants is actually marigolds. They're one of the best companion plants out there. They help basically all vegetables, so you don't have to have a list or a chart of what works best for what vegetables. If you grew just marigolds by themselves, they basically help your entire garden. Now, I like mint and spearmint because it repels both ants and cabbage moths. And as you noticed, I have all my mint very close to all my cabbage there, right? And I haven't had too much of a problem because I do keep my cabbage covered at night. But mint and spearmint are very, very good for repelling the moth problem that will land on my cabbage patch. Now, the one thing you want to keep aware of when it comes to mint, or any type of mint, it can be spearmint, mint in general, is that if you go ahead and plant it in a regular garden, mint has a way of overtaking your garden and just growing out of control. It's very easy to grow, but it just grows out of control. So if you have it in the regular garden, it will end up offshooting everywhere in your garden. And once that happens, sometimes it's really hard to control. So keep that in mind. If you grow it in pots or you grow it in a raised bed, you can somewhat keep it in check, but make sure you're well aware that it just sends off shoots everywhere and it will overtake your whole garden space if you're just growing it in the ground. Now, another herb that I grow is sage. It's a helper herb in the garden which can protect, protect my cabbages. So since I do use sage every so often, not nearly as much as rosemary or oregano, but just for the option of having it available for me, I do keep some sage around. Now, rosemary is good because it does deter the cabbage fly, and it does help with broccoli and other things. And I'll go ahead and grow quite a bit of rosemary because I do use the sprigs quite a bit for whether it's if I'm basting and cooking my steak in a flat steak pan and I'm basting it with butter, I usually use a sprig of rosemary at the very end. I also use rosemary for different kinds of fish dishes. And then one of my favorites is actually something very, very simple, which is the roasted potatoes. I actually, instead of frying my roasted potatoes, I go ahead and I cut them up into quarter sizes and bite-sized pieces, and then I toss them in a little bit of olive oil, just a sprinkle of salt and pepper. And I take the rosemary sprigs and sheet them off and use the needles. And I actually go ahead and take a couple extra steps, and I'll just kind of chop up the needles until they're about a third of the actual size needles, and then I'll toss them in the diced up potatoes, whether it's red potatoes or Yukon Jack potatoes, and then I'll go ahead and roast them in the oven. And so that's one of my favorite vegetables that I'll go ahead and make using the rosemary. But rosemary has a number of choices. I know some people don't like rosemary at all, but it's great because rosemary and oregano I do use quite a bit in the cooking. Now, one thing nice about rosemary and oregano, and like this oregano here has been outside the whole entire winter. Now, rosemary and oregano can stay outdoors all winter long. They are winter hardy. I want to show you this rosemary here, or this oregano here. This oregano here, take a look at where the center of this pot was. It actually died off completely. There was not a single green leaf showing in the late winter, early spring. And one thing great about oregano is always comes back. So if you want to bring your oregano plant, if it's in a tiny pot, you can bring it indoors as long as it's by a south-facing window and keep it there. But if you don't, You can go ahead and keep it in your garden. I kind of keep it in a partial sunny location with partial ability to get rain, meaning I keep it under the overhang. And so if it's a sunny day, it gets a hit with a little bit of sun. And then it's undercover, so unless it's raining sideways, it doesn't get watered. So it's not getting drenched throughout the whole winter. So it's kind of like the perfect spot. Now, for whatever reason, I forgot about this oregano. It was sitting in the middle of my flower bed garden, and I forgot all about it. And so it completely died off this past winter. But oregano is very hardy. It actually fully came back. And so that's one thing nice about oregano and rosemary. They are very cold hardy and they always come back. Now I go ahead and I grow chives along with my rosemary because it improves the flavor of rosemary, and then it deters the carrot flies. Now, in order to keep tomatoes away, keep bugs away from your tomatoes, like I said, you can go ahead and grow marigolds. For further protection from different kinds of pests and bugs and other things, you can plant basil close by, beans. You can do chives, garlic, mint, onion, and parsley. Those are all the type of herbs and vegetables you can grow that accompany tomatoes, because they'll keep a lot of bugs away. Now, companion plants, in terms of minimizing the pests that are in your cabbage patch, like I said before, are going to be your peppermint, your rosemary, your sage, your thyme. And anybody who's grown cabbage knows that these cabbage moths and larvae will eat up a cabbage patch very easily. Now, from sugar peas to green beans, legumes are a great choice to grow with cucumbers because they provide extra nitrogen in your soil. So if you're doing a raised bed or a garden bed, sowing directly into your garden, if you grow your cucumbers and beans and snap peas close together, it'll be good because the extra nitrogen that is provided from the cucumbers will add it to the soil. And then, of course, with those items, you can do marigolds around it, circling your regular garden or your raised bed. Now, one thing that you're going to have to deal with is aphids. And marigolds are really good with cucumber leaves that are, where the aphids kind of form underneath the cucumber leaves. And I've noticed I've had really huge success with growing marigolds close by to my cucumbers because it keeps all the aphid population pretty much to zero. So, like I said before, marigolds are great for everything across the board, whether it's lice, mosquitoes, rabbits, and then, of course, all pests and insects. Another thing you can grow is mint. They help repel spiders, ants, and mosquitoes. Mint is a general, it's one of the better herbs to grow in your garden because it kind of deters a greater percentage of the bugs out there. And then basil is good as a company plant for your tomatoes and mosquitoes and house flies. And so there's a number of things that you can go ahead and grow based on what you like. I typically don't like to grow herbs that I don't like to eat. So if I know that I'm going to use the herb possibly for a little bit of cooking, then I'll go ahead and use it, grow it. And so that way I can not only use it for cooking or for teas, but also it'll help my garden in general. Now, if you're into flowers, petunias help repel leaf hoppers and squash bugs. I do have quite a few squash bugs in this area. And so if I wanted to go ahead and not have to cover my squash, my zucchini, my pumpkins this year, I can go ahead and grow petunias in pots and kind of stagger them and put them in the garden, and it'll help go ahead and keep away the squash bugs, tomato hornworms, and aphids. They're pretty good about that. So other than that, I think let's see here, we talked about the soil. We talked about the watering. We talked about the sunshine. Now, the last thing I want to talk to you is when it pertains mostly to like dill and cilantro, anything where you're trying to get the leaves, anything like that, we try not to keep them directly in the sun, or we don't want to go ahead and make sure we underwater those items because they have a tendency to bolt and turn into flowers, flower buds into flowers which will change the flavor and the texture of the leaves once it bolts. So when it comes to cilantro, if we want to keep on having very healthy looking leaves coming out for our cilantro, and we don't want it to bolt, and we don't want our dill to bolt, we're going to head and make sure not to make our soil soggy, but during the hottest part of the summer and hottest sunny days, you want to make sure that you give it some sort of shade or partial shade. If you go ahead and use a paint strainer bag or some sort of cheesecloth, that'll help. And then make sure you never let it get bone dry, because when you let your cilantro and your dill and things where you're using the leaves mostly, and you let them to get bone dry, those particular type of herbs will bolt and start flowering. And once that happens, you can go ahead and pinch them off, but once it happens, it's hard to turn it around. And so try to keep those type of plants moist and watered at all times. Don't let the pot get bone dry. Unfortunately, I went ahead and I forgot about this cilantro because it was on the other side of the garden. This one here got watered already today, so the tops are already wet. But I'm going to go ahead and water down my cilantro now, my coriander, and give it the water it needs. In the middle of the summer, if I had done that, it would have forced the plant to think that, hey, it's time for me to flower. So that's a little bit about the herbs. What I'm going to do is, as we get into the middle part of the summer, I'll take each individual herb, whether it's basil, oregano, rosemary, cilantro, and I'll kind of do a full report on each individual plant one at a time. I have a lot of notes and a lot of things I can kind of provide you of each individual herb. I'm a little bit tied up right now doing the late evening gardening and cleanup right now. But as we get into another month or two, I'll try to go ahead and make sure I go through the most popular herbs and give you some feedback and a reporting back on all the things I know about how to take care of each individual herb. Now, like I said at the beginning of this video, herbs are pretty easy to grow. It doesn't take a lot of talent to grow herbs, so that's the one thing nice. Unlike vegetables that do need a few things to kind of go its way to be successful, you can kind of give poor service to your herbs and they'll grow just fine. But that's a little bit about some general topics and information on herbs, and I'll be in touch with more details of each individual herbs down the road.